Imagine walking through the rain, lost in your own thoughts, when suddenly you see a small child collapse on the sidewalk. Crowds rush past, umbrellas shielding them from the storm, but no one stops. Then, a man in a suit, wealthy, successful, but hollow inside, kneels in the rain to hold her trembling hand. In that moment, two broken worlds collide, and neither will ever be the same again. This is not just a story about a lonely CEO or a sick little girl. It is about what it means to stay when others walk away, about the fragile threads of hope that can turn strangers into family. If stories like this move you, if you believe in second chances and the quiet miracles of love, then you belong here with us. Subscribe to the Retold Stories, and let's walk this journey together. The city had always been alive with motion, but on this particular afternoon, Boston seemed weighed down by rain. Silver sheets blurred the streets, smudging the skyline into ghostly outlines. Cars hissed by on slick pavement, their lights dissolving into the drizzle. The sidewalks were crowded with hurried people ducking under umbrellas, but no one looked up, no one slowed down. They were all moving forward, all trying to outpace the storm. At the edge of this restless current sat Michael Anderson, a man who could afford a car and driver waiting around the corner, but who, for reasons he could not quite name, had chosen to wait on a worn wooden bench at a bus stop. He wore a suit worth more than most people's monthly wages, but it looked strangely out of place against the peeling paint of the bench and the pooling water gathering at its feet. A paper cup of coffee rested in his hand, steam long gone, the liquid untouched. His eyes were distant, unfocused, as if they had long ago grown tired of looking. Meetings had been canceled, calls postponed, yet even in that sudden freedom, he felt no relief. He had built a life around control, structure, and goals, but lately it all felt brittle, like glass stretched too thin. For years he had told himself that exhaustion was the price of success, but this was not exhaustion coffee could cure. This was the fatigue of a heart that had gone untouched for too long. Raindrops clung to his lapels, rolled off his polished shoes, and slid down the edges of his sleeve. He did not even notice. His mind was somewhere else, circling numbers, mergers, and obligations that no longer seemed to matter. He had spent decades climbing, but the higher he rose, the lonelier the air became. At that bus stop, in the blur of gray, he looked like a man waiting for something unnamed, though he would have never admitted it aloud. That was when he saw her. At first, she was little more than a shadow moving through the curtain of rain. A small figure, fragile and unsteady, clutching a thin paper bag against her chest. Her coat was soaked, clinging to her frame like tissue, her shoes worn thin and far too small. Each step looked like it might be her last. She reached the edge of the bench, tried to sit, and collapsed before she even touched the wood. Her body folded to the ground, the bag spilling open beside her. Inside lay the contents of a life reduced to scraps: a bruised apple, 2 pieces of bread wrapped in napkins, a dented thermos. Michael reacted before thought could intervene. The coffee cup fell to the ground, forgotten, as he dropped to his knees on the wet concrete. His expensive trousers soaked through instantly, but he did not care. His hand found hers, shockingly cold, trembling, so thin he could feel every bone beneath her skin. A pulse of pain, sharp and unfamiliar, struck his chest. It was not fear or surprise. It was recognition, like an echo of a memory he had buried too deep. Years ago, he had been the one on the floor, reaching for help in the dark. For a long moment, he could not breathe. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy with exhaustion. When she managed to open them, he saw eyes far too large for her small face, eyes that carried a gravity no child should have to bear. She whispered, barely audible through the rain, "I have to bring dinner home. Mommy's really sick." Then her head tilted weakly against his arm. The city moved on around them, cars splashing through puddles, horns blaring in the distance, pedestrians hurrying by without so much as a glance. But for Michael, everything froze. Those words lodged themselves inside him. "Mommy's really sick." The child tried to rise again, but her body would not obey. He gently placed the bruised apple and the thermos back into the soggy bag, then lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He could feel the sharpness of her shoulders, the fragility of her frame. She curled instinctively into his chest, one hand clutching at his collar as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. His driver saw him rushing toward the car, confusion flashing briefly across his face before Michael barked an order. Mass General. Emergency. The man nodded without hesitation and held the door open. Inside the warm interior of the town car, Michael held the girl tightly, his hand pressed against her back as if to reassure himself she was still there. The rain beat against the roof. The wipers squeaked rhythmically, but all he could hear was the shallow, uneven breath against his chest. At the hospital, the automatic doors parted with a hiss, bright light flooding over them. Michael strode past the waiting area, straight to the triage desk. The nurses moved quickly, eyes narrowing at the sight of a child soaked to the bone in the arms of a man dressed like a boardroom executive. Name? One asked briskly. Michael opened his mouth but realized he had none to give. Before he could answer, the girl stirred, whispering softly, "Ava. My name's Ava." Then she went limp again. Michael stood frozen for a moment, watching as nurses lifted her onto a gurney and rushed her down the hall. The antiseptic sting of the hospital hit. His nose, mixing with the memory of rain still dripping from his sleeves. He felt unmoored, like something essential inside him had cracked. He followed without asking permission. The sharp sounds of the hospital blurring together. Beeping monitors, hurried footsteps, the cry of a newborn down the hall. All of it faded against the weight of one truth. This little girl had no one else. He should have been a stranger, a passerby, someone who would have looked away like the dozens of others who walked past the bus stop. But he could not this time. Something in her voice had tethered him, pulled him back to a place he had long sworn never to revisit. Hours later, Ava lay curled beneath a thin hospital blanket, her small frame barely disturbing the sheets. Her face was pale, but her breathing had steadied. Michael sat beside her, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie discarded on a nearby chair. He had refused coffee, ignored the buzzing of his phone, and had not moved in nearly an hour. His eyes were fixed on her chest, rising and falling, each breath like proof against a fear he could not quite name. When she finally opened her eyes again, they were calm, steady, and far older than her years. "Can I go home now?" she asked, voice dry, but unwavering. "My mom needs me." Her words pierced through him like a blade. He had expected tears, panic, pleas for comfort. Instead, she spoke with a quiet determination, the voice of someone who had carried responsibility far beyond her age. In her expression, he saw not weakness, but resilience. And in that resilience he felt both awe and heartbreak. He realized then that this was not just a child in need. This was a soul who had been surviving in silence, who had learned too early not to expect help. For the first time in years, Michael Anderson understood that his life was no longer his own. Something had shifted, irrevocably, the moment he took her hand. And deep down, he knew he could not walk away. The rain outside had thinned into a soft drizzle by the time Michael returned to the hospital room. The storm that had washed the city now lingered only as streaks across the wide glass window, faint reminders of the chaos that had delivered a child into his arms. Ava lay beneath a thin blanket, her hair damp, her breaths shallow but steadier than before. He had not left her side for hours, ignoring messages that buzzed endlessly on his phone, ignoring the reality that an entire corporate empire waited for his attention. Nothing seemed to matter except the fragile rise and fall of her chest. When her eyes opened again, they were not clouded by fear. She looked at him with a calm too old for her age. Her first words were not about herself, not about hunger or pain. They were about her mother. Michael asked questions gently, expecting tears or hesitation. Instead, Ava spoke plainly, her small voice steady in the fluorescent light. She told him her mother had been sick for months, that food was scarce, that sometimes she waited in long lines for bread and soup. She confessed she had not eaten since yesterday morning. She said these things as though she were listing groceries, as though survival was nothing more than a daily routine. Michael's chest tightened as he listened. He had spent decades sitting across polished tables discussing losses and gains, yet the number she offered him cut deeper than any financial blow. A little girl who counted meals the way others counted coins. A child who accepted hunger and sickness as the ordinary rhythm of life. He leaned forward, searching for something to say, but Ava continued before he could find words. "We are not looking for saving," she whispered. "We just need a little time." The statement was so clear, so raw, that he felt it pierce through layers of armor he had built across years of indifference. She was not begging. She was not asking for pity. She was demanding dignity in the only way she knew. Her resilience unsettled him. He had expected fragility, but what he saw instead was strength. Quiet, defiant strength that stood in stark contrast to her frail body. She was 7, but her voice carried the weight of someone who had already lived through a lifetime of disappointment. In that moment, Michael realized she was not simply surviving. She was holding the world together for herself and for the mother waiting somewhere in the shadows. Later that evening, when Ava was strong enough to leave the hospital, Michael accompanied her back to the place she called home. The driver turned down narrow streets that seemed to shrink with each block, until they arrived at a building with cracked bricks and a staircase sagging under years of neglect. The hallway smelled of mildew and old heat, the paint peeling in long strips. Ava moved with certainty, unlocking a door with a key tied to a frayed shoelace. Inside, the apartment was little more than a single room. The air was heavy with dampness and the faint odor of illness. A mattress lay on the floor beneath piles of mismatched blankets. On it rested Elena, her mother. The sight stole Michael's breath. She was young but looked decades older, her face hollow, lips tinged blue. A dry cloth lay across her forehead, brittle with age. Her body barely stirred as Ava hurried to her side. Michael crouched near, instinctively checking for a pulse. It was there, faint but present. Her breathing came in shallow rasps that spoke of neglect, of years without proper care. Ava explained in her steady way that her mother used to be strong, that she once worked at a clinic helping others, but when she grew ill, no one helped her back. She held up a worn badge with her mother's name, as though it were proof of a life that had once mattered. Michael looked around the room, at the dented refrigerator, the cracked fan, the peeling wallpaper. It was not just poverty. It was abandonment. A mother and child surviving on scraps of food and scraps of hope. Ava pulled out a small tin box from beneath a folded towel. Inside were a few crumpled bills, coins, and a note written in childish handwriting. "Dear Mommy, if you wake up and I am not here, do not be scared. I am just getting dinner. I love you." She tucked the note back with a care that made Michael's throat tighten. He had spent his life chasing contracts and deals, yet in that moment all he could think about was how a 7-year-old girl carried responsibility heavier than most men he knew. He knew instantly this could not continue. Elena needed care that no clinic would provide without money, and money was something Michael had in abundance. He pulled out his phone and called for a private ambulance. Ava hesitated, asking in a small voice if they would let her stay with her mother. Michael met her eyes and promised, "You are not going anywhere without her." He had not used the word promise in years, not in any way that mattered, but it felt right on his tongue. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, lifting Elena gently onto a stretcher. Ava held her mother's hand the entire time, whispering softly. Michael followed them down the stairs, carrying her small backpack in one hand, resting the other on her shoulder. In the ambulance, he sat beside her, ignoring the curious glances of the medics. He had never sat in the back of such a vehicle before, but he knew without question that this was exactly where he needed to be. At the private facility, nurses moved quickly, wheeling Elena away for immediate treatment. Michael stayed with Ava, buying her hot cocoa from a vending machine. She held the cup carefully but did not drink, her eyes fixed on the doors that had closed behind her mother. "Do you think they will help her?" she asked. Michael answered without hesitation, "Yes, and I will be here every step." For the first time, her shoulders relaxed slightly. She leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his arm, and fell asleep. He did not move. He stayed. The hours passed. Michael's driver delivered a duffel bag with clothes, but Michael had no intention of leaving. For the first time in years, he was not waiting for numbers or updates from a boardroom. He was waiting for a pulse. He watched Ava sleep beside him, small and fragile, clutching a worn rabbit in her lap. He had never imagined himself in this place, but as dawn crept through the windows, he realized something had changed. This was no longer about a chance encounter. It was about a choice. He had chosen to stay. And in that choice, his heart had begun to awaken in ways he thought were long gone. The days that followed were a blur of waiting rooms and whispered updates. Elena remained fragile but alive. each hour adding a sliver of hope to a picture that had once seemed hopeless. Ava stayed close to her mother's side, her small hand always searching for contact. Michael was there too, moving between the two of them, carrying cups of cocoa, reading hospital charts, ignoring the endless stream of calls from his office. For the first time in his life, he had stopped chasing numbers. He was chasing breath, strength, and the fragile light of a family that was beginning to form in front of him. Then came the envelope. A nurse carried it in one evening, addressed formally to Elena Brooks. Michael opened it carefully, his eyes catching on the name written across the top, Jacob Brooks. The words inside were cold, legal, written in the heavy language of custody petitions and parental rights. It spoke of neglect, incapacity, and the claim of a man who had been absent for nearly a decade. Michael's stomach tightened as he realized what it meant. Just when Elena was fighting her way back, the man who had abandoned her was attempting to take Ava away. When Michael showed Elena the letter, her face went pale. She whispered, barely audible, "He is trying to take her, and I do not have the strength to fight alone." Michael clasped her hand firmly. "You are not alone. Not anymore." The words settled like a vow, spoken not out of obligation but conviction. He knew then that the path forward would not be easy, but he was ready. The courthouse stood between a bank and a diner, ordinary from the outside but monumental in that moment. Michael walked through its doors with Ava and Elena, who was too weak to stand but insisted on attending in a wheelchair. The week leading up to the hearing had been filled with late nights, meetings with lawyers, and collecting evidence of Ava's life, school records, medical reports, testimony from nurses and doctors. Elena had written a sworn affidavit, recounting the years of silence, the abandonment, and the way Ava had carried burdens no child should. She ended with a line that brought tears to Michael's eyes. Michael did not replace anyone. He simply became someone we could count on. Jacob was already there when they entered, dressed in a suit that did not quite fit, his face carefully arranged into the mask of a reformed man. He spoke of recovery, of second chances, of his desire to be a father again. He talked of responsibility and faith, but when questioned about Ava's life, her birthday, her school, her favorite food, he faltered, not because he lied, but because he simply did not know. The silence that followed each question spoke louder than any speech. When it was Michael's turn, he did not bring notes or prepared statements. He stood, straightened the sleeves of his jacket, and spoke plainly. "I did not come into Ava's life because I had to. I came because she needed someone. And I stayed because I realized I needed her just as much. I am not here to claim a title or a role I did not earn. I am here because when she stood in the rain, weak and afraid, she did not ask for money or pity. She asked for time. She asked for someone who would not walk away. I promised her I would not, and I intend to keep that promise. Family is not about blood. It is about who stays." The courtroom was silent when he finished. Even the judge leaned back, thoughtful. Finally, she turned to Ava, who sat quietly near the back with a guardian by her side. "Ava," she said gently, "you have been very brave. May I ask you something?" Ava nodded. "Where do you want to live?" The child looked first at her mother, fragile and trembling, then at Michael. Her voice was soft but unwavering. With the people who did not leave, it was enough. Moments later, the judge signed the order, granting joint guardianship to Michael during Elena's recovery and suspending Jacob's rights until further evaluation. The gavel did not slam. It did not need to. The decision was final. Relief washed over the room. Elena wept softly, half from exhaustion, half from gratitude. Michael bent beside Ava, taking her small hands in his. "It is just beginning," he whispered, "but the worst part is over." That night, back at the hospital, the three of them sat together in a quiet room. Elena in her bed, Ava curled beside her, Michael in the chair nearby. The storm that had shadowed their days felt as if it had finally lifted. Hope, fragile but steady, glowed between them. Weeks later, sunlight streamed through the windows of a small new apartment. The walls smelled faintly of fresh paint, and Ava's drawings were already scattered across the rooms, rainbows, flowers, and figures with hands linked. Elena sat at a small table, still frail but stronger with each passing day. Ava hummed as she set bowls of oatmeal on the table, her bare feet swinging. Michael buttered toast, his sleeves rolled up, moving with an ease that felt new. They ate together, hands brushing, laughter soft but real. For the first time in years, Michael felt something he could only describe as belonging. After breakfast, Ava pulled them both to the living room to show a new drawing. 3 hands, one large, one gentle, one small, linked together in the shape of a heart. She smiled proudly as she handed it over. Michael held the picture for a long time, then placed it on the wall above the table. "This one," he said quietly, "goes in the center." That evening they walked together in a nearby park, the same city that had once seemed so gray, now glowing with the warmth of twilight. Ava ran ahead, laughing, her arms stretched like wings. Elena walked slowly beside Michael, their hands brushing before joining firmly together. She looked at him and whispered, "You did not have to stay." Michael met her gaze steadily. "But I did, and I always will." The city around them continued its endless motion. But for Michael, Ava, and Elena, the world had shifted. They were no longer fragments surviving on their own. They were bound by something stronger than circumstance. They were a family born not from blood, but from the courage to stay. And in that simple truth, Michael discovered the one thing his wealth had never been able to buy: a place to call home. Sometimes the greatest stories do not begin with triumph. They begin in the rain, in the silence of a bus stop, in the fragile heartbeat of a child who refuses to give up. Michael never planned to sit on that bench, just as Ava never planned to collapse into his arms. Elena never planned to lose her strength, and Jacob never planned to walk away. But life rarely follows plans. Instead, it carves unexpected paths, placing strangers in each other's way and asking a single question: will you stay, or will you walk past? Michael had built an empire from ambition, but that day taught him that empires do not keep you warm at night. They do not hold your hand when you are tired. They do not whisper your name when you are about to give up. Ava did all of those things without even meaning to. Her courage, her quiet dignity, her ability to ask for nothing but time, it awakened something in him that had long been buried. By the time Elena opened her eyes again, the choice had already been made. He was not leaving. Not then, not ever. Ava's words echoed through every courtroom, every hospital corridor, every quiet moment when the weight of fear threatened to crush them. "I want to be with the people who did not leave." That simple sentence carried more power than any legal argument, because it held the truth we all crave. We do not need perfection. We do not need promises written in contracts. We need someone who stays, someone who chooses us, not out of duty, but out of love. In the end, the story was not about a CEO or a sick child. It was about the miracle of presence, about the way hope grows in the smallest gestures. A cup of cocoa, a new set of crayons, a hand held in silence. It was about how a man who once measured his life in profit margins discovered that the only wealth worth keeping was the bond between 3 hands linked together in the shape of a heart. If this story has touched you, if it has reminded you that family is not only who we are born to, but who chooses to stand beside us, then you already understand why stories like these matter. They remind us that even in the darkest storms, kindness can break through. They remind us that love can be found in unexpected places, and that staying is sometimes the most heroic act of all. Here at the Retold Stories, we believe in telling the kind of tales that linger, that stir something deep inside you, that make you pause and remember what truly matters. If you want more stories that heal, that inspire, and that remind you of the power of compassion, we invite you to join us. Subscribe today and let us continue this journey together. Because somewhere out there, another story is waiting to be told, and you will not want to miss it.